On May 10, 1994, Nelson Mandela was democratically elected as South Africa's first black president. It was a victory for the oppressed South Africans, and for the first time in a long time, a new sense of hope emerged. This sense of hope was not always present, for just a few short decades ago, laws were put into place to ensure segregation and white dominance, and formally established into apartheid, a legislative system that took away the individual rights of non-white citizens. Yet, black South Africans protected their natural rights from apartheid laws through riots and campaigns beginning in the 1950s, and ultimately forced South Africa's parliamentary government to change their legislative system for a more stable society.
By the time we get to the 1800s, they discover diamonds, and they also discover gold in the mid-1800s, and that meant a big scramble for space, for territory, and for power.
They're rich in raw materials like that, and they also have a certain amount of industry that builds on those raw materials.
The skilled work went to whites, and unskilled work went to Africans.
A race-based system ensured high wages for the Dutch, and by the early 1900s, many colored South Africans plummeted into poverty. Poverty was intensified with the enactment of the Native Land Act in 1913, which prohibited black South Africans from buying, lending, or leasing land, and was intended to keep them as menial workers. As a result of this law, only 7% of the land was owned by black South Africans. In 1948, the Afrikaner National Party, composed of Dutch people, gained control of the government. Their rise to power led to the official legislative enactment known as Grand Apartheid. This segregation system is literally translated to mean state of being apart. This new scheme limited social and political rights, as well as minimized educational and economic opportunities for colored people. A.L. Geyer, an apartheid supporter, states that while there seems to be two possible lines of development, apartheid or partnership meaning cooperation of the individual citizens within a single community, irrespective of race, the Afrikaner Dutch ultimately chose the enactment of apartheid because in order to self-preserve their race and maintain white dominance, they manufactured a system that deprived black South Africans of fundamental human rights.
Legislation in South Africa had to do with land. Another had to do with jobs, what kinds of jobs Africans could have. A third had to do with places of residence. There are certain places in the cities where Africans could not own houses. And a fourth had to do with voting.
In particular, the Population Registration Act of 1950 sparked mass public outrage. This law required each South African to be racially classified and labeled into three groups: white, black, and colored, meaning Indian or Asian, creating social divisions and resentment. The Natives Passbook Act of 1952 required colored people to carry their identification and records at all times. The passbook included fingerprints, photographs, and other identification information. If one didn't carry their documents with them, they would be arrested. This prevented the movement of black people from exploring different opportunities due to their race.
After 1948 and the election of the National Party and the construction of these new, much more intensive laws and restrictions on non-whites, most of those parties sort of stepped up the level of challenge that they were making to the government. And that was especially tied to the younger generation of leaders that Mandela was part of. Mandela, Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, they just felt they couldn't tolerate anymore the kind of open repression that they were dealing with. And from that point on, the townships in South Africa were pretty close to ungovernable.
The ANC took responsibility to protect oppressed South African people, uniting together to fight discrimination laws by peaceful protests. The Defiance Campaign of 1950 purposely broke apartheid laws to express their resentment, like non-Europeans who walk into European-only areas.
Demonstrations against the South African government's strict apartheid policies flare into shocking violence. At Sharpsville, an industrial township, thousands gather outside a police station in protest against new laws requiring every African to carry a pass at all times. The crowd refused to disperse and began stoning the police, who opened fire into the crowd from behind a wire fence. In 2 days of demonstrations that began here, between 50 and 100 were killed and hundreds injured. Worldwide protests were raised including a condemnation of the violence by the United States State Department. In South Africa, a mass work boycott by Africans is crippling industry in the area. An uneasy calm reigns. The conditions that led to the Sharpsville tragedy continue unchanged.
The Africans want a franchise on the basis of one man, one vote. They want political independence.
A major protest angered towards the racial passbook led to the Sharpeville massacre on March 21, 1960, near Johannesburg. Hundreds of people showed up without their passbooks. The police panicked and began shooting into the crowd, killing 69 people and wounding 186. The government still didn't reconsider reform after this flustering event. However, this event was successful in increasing international attention of more powerful organizations. Because apartheid caused instability, the number of deaths and arrests rose. Students also fought hardships in school due to apartheid. The Afrikaans Medium Decree of 1974 forced all black schools to use Afrikaans and English, preventing them from academic improvement. SASO, a student organization led by Stephen Biko, fought to make sure the government wouldn't obstruct the education experience they cherished.
But then in 1976, young people, young Africans especially in the townships, left school to fight the government. And in a way, they never came back into school. They stayed in the streets. The country became more and more ungovernable, and it created enormous pressure.
We desire education, and we think it's a good thing. But you don't have to have education in order to know that you want certain fundamental rights. So you have got aspirations, you have got claims.
In the 1980s, international influences took responsibility by using their power to help abandon apartheid. The Commonwealth expressed their displeasure towards apartheid, and international businesses felt it was embarrassing to invest in South Africa, hurting their economy. By 1973, the United Nations condemned apartheid and declared it a crime against humanity, challenging the South African government. Resolution 1761 called upon nations to boycott South African goods, stinging their economy and showing displeasure, pressuring immediate alteration. The U.S. sanction of 1986 requested many modifications be made to South Africa's nation, like changing its political system by negotiating reform. Another request was to release activist leaders like Nelson Mandela. In 1990, Frederick de Klerk, the new South African president, released Nelson Mandela due to national and international pressure. Klerk was willing to negotiate with the ANC, which was a major shift in the governmental position.
An historic moment to see thousands of people lining up to vote for the first time in their own country. Grandmothers who had grown up under and who had raised families under apartheid and who were never recognized as citizens in their own country could now vote for a representative government of their own choosing under a constitution which their representatives had negotiated. That their humanity and their dignity was being finally acknowledged in their own country. Was a wonderful moment.
In 1994, South Africa held its first truly democratic elections. The African National Congress won 63% of the vote. Its leader, Nelson Mandela, became president of South Africa's first multiracial democracy.
The people of South Africa have spoken in this election. They want change, and change is what they will get.
A reconstruction development program that was intended to create a lot of new housing, to improve living conditions in the townships, and to create kind of sewer networks, power, to improve education, to do all the things that apartheid had denied people, and to do them as fast and as efficiently as possible.
The ANC takes responsibility and tries to achieve a non-racist, non-sexist, united democratic society based on the Freedom Charter, allowing population groups to coexist peacefully, exterminating traces of violence, prejudice, and injustice. The past will always be a reminder of the instability apartheid caused, which hopefully will prevent another oppressive era to occur.
In South Africa, you couldn't decide where you could live. You were forced to live in a black township.
Few predicted that they would be able to hold the country together at the end of apartheid. The polarization of the country was a war between the blacks and the whites.
Peace has been brought upon South Africa thanks to the determination of powerful activists, international influences, and most importantly, the people who never stopped trying. It was a major struggle, but today, South Africa continues on a path to a fair, steady, and prosperous society.